Greetings, everyone. This is PrinceOfGeists back looking at the pre-constructed decks of Magic the Gathering. I hope you all have been doing well. So we recently wrapped up our gameplay matches for the decks of the 2011 core set. So now I thought I'd sit down and go over the actual cards in the deck, because we've seen a bunch of games from each of them, but we haven't seen all of the cards. So this will give a better understanding of what the deck is trying to do. First up, we have the deck we used for our very first video, and it's Power of Prophecy. So, blue-white in Magic history has usually been one of two things. It's either been control, looking to stall until it can drop a huge bomb in the late game, or it's usually the Skies deck, where you overrun your opponent with a bunch of flyers. Power of Prophecy has elements of both of these, which we're going to go over. So the foil face rare of the deck is Conundrum Sphinx. So it's a 4/4 flyer for 4 mana, which already is quite a strong deal for that cost. It's got an interesting ability. When it attacks, each player names a card, and then they reveal their top card, and if you guessed correctly, you get to put that card in your hand. That is interesting, not something that's going to go off too often. Those of you who may have watched the gameplay video may have seen me try to use this card, but that had more to do in line with Forge not letting you type in whatever you want. If you can just verbally name a card, you can usually do a little bit better. It's usually best to just name an island, since you have 16 of them, in order to get the most of it. That being said, the Sphinx does have some decent support in this deck. M11 brought back the Scry mechanic before it became evergreen in Magic Origins. And not only are the Scry cards from M11 all really good, but they also help with manipulating your top cards so you know what's there for the Conundrum Sphinx. So supporting that, you've got Crystal Ball, which is an artifact that can repeatedly let you scry 2. It's kind of like the poor man's Sensei's Divining Top, but it's still a pretty good card and will always help you smooth out your draws in the late game. 2/4C is this deck's version of the stock Divination card. They didn't reprint Divination in this set because we got 4C instead. It's 1 more mana, but it lets you scry 4 before drawing 2 cards, which is a fantastic deal. And we even have a couple creatures do that, because we have 2 copies of Augury Owl. For the longest time, they would reprint Sage Owl in the core sets, which let you look at 4 cards and then put them all back on top in any order. Augury Owl lets you scry 3, so it's 1 less card, but the fact that you can put stuff you don't want on the bottom instead of being forced to draw it is a really good deal. But yeah, all of these will help you actually get that Sphinx's ability off more often, and even if you can't, it's still a 4/4 flyer. It's still a decent beater that'll help you win the game. And those aren't our early flyers, so on top of the Sphinx and the Owl, 2 Cloud Elementals are pretty bog standard. They're 2/3 flyers for 3, which is a decent deal. They have this drawback of only blocking other flying creatures, but you'll usually be using it to attack anyway. Azure Drake is one that's been in a few core sets up to this one. It's just a 2/4 flyer for 4, which does compare poorly to the Sphinx, but it is a common, to be fair. And it's got a good amount of toughness. It's just out of range of Lightning Bolt, which was still in the environment at the time. So that's always a plus. The best one that we saw during our games is probably the 2 Air Servants. So the Servants are 4/3 flyers, so hit pretty big, although it is just frail enough to be fried by lightning bolt, but that's still worth it. The main benefit to this is that it has an activated ability to tap other flying creatures. So it's going to be really hard for your opponent to set up defenses against this. So you can usually force them through for damage. Those are all our flyers. We do have a couple extra evasive creatures with the usual sea monsters that they'll put in the blue intro packs. Harbor Servant, for one, is a 5/5 with Island Walk. So back in the day, they had land walk abilities where if your opponent controlled a specific land, they just couldn't block this creature. But the obvious problem was if they're not playing islands, then that ability is useless. Then you're just paying 6 mana for a 5/5. And you're reliant upon your own islands to get past the drawback the Harbor Serpent has. If there are fewer than 5 islands, it's not attacking. But that can be helped with our other rare. So we have Stormtide Leviathan, which is an 8/8 for Island Walk for 8, so even bigger. And it conveniently turns every land into an island. So no matter what your opponent is playing, that Island Walk will always be relevant. And finally, anything without flying or Island Walk just can't attack. 8 mana is an awful lot, but if your opponent doesn't have an answer for this immediately when it hits the field, it's probably going to end the game very fast. So this is where the blue control strategy comes in, stalling the game until you can drop a giant bomb like this. Now, as far as stalling goes, you do have some options to hold your opponent off on the ground while you're attacking in the air. There's 2 Maritime Guards, which are just 1/3s, but that can hold off some early attacks at least. Scroll Thief is also a 1/3. This one costs a bit more mana, but it has an effect to let you draw a card when it hits the opponent. It doesn't have any sort of evasion, but sometimes you can just force damage through when they're open. You have a few cards in here that tap down enemy creatures, so it might come up. There's 2 Aether Adepts, which are 2/2s that just bounce a creature back to the opponent's hand when they show up, so that can be a way to force damage through, or at least stall for time. Armored Cancrix is another high toughness creature, but it's honestly pretty weak. It's just a 2/5 and it costs 5 whole mana, which is not ideal. The stall tactics kind of need to come into play in the early game, like with the Maritime Guard. 5 mana, you kind of want to be dropping actual offensive cards by that point. It's also worth noting that the deck uses white mana, so we had access to this, the Siege Mastodon from the same set. It's also 5 mana, but this time it's a 3/5 instead of a 2/5. And to be honest, Siege Mastodon isn't a particularly good card either, but a 3/5 would have been preferable to a 2/5. And we could have run that. So the Cancrix is an easy cut for something better for this deck. The best defensive tool you have is probably Wall of Frost. This is 3 mana for a 7 toughness creature, and it'll freeze anything it blocks. So that's a pretty good deterrent for keeping your opponent's creatures away. You also have your only white creature in the deck, which is Blinding Mage. So this one doesn't have high toughness, but it does have the ability to tap creatures. So this can keep your opponent's best attacker off. It can tap defenders to let something like the Scroll Thief do. The Blinding Mage is just a pretty useful utility creature. And other than that, we also have 2 copies of Water Servant. This is a decent deal for its cost. 3/4 for 4 mana is good. It can change its power and toughness with blue mana. So it can be a decent beater or a really strong defender. It's just a nice versatile card that's also good for the deck. That's all of our creatures. Moving on to the non-creature spells. So the non-creature spells are a bit all over the place. There admittedly isn't as much straight removal as you would like. You have one copy of Pacifism, which is like the bread and butter white removal spell. Creature can't attack or block. You have a Mind Control, which can just steal a creature for 5 mana. And your only instant speed removal is Condemn. Although, to be fair, Condemn is a very strong card. You can put an attacking creature on the bottom of its owner's library for just 1 mana. It does have the drawback of giving them a little bit of life, but that's not too bad. It's pretty much Swords to Plowshares if Swords to Plowshares were actually kind of fair. But it's still a very strong card. As far as 1 mana white removal, there isn't a lot that's better than this besides Swords to Plowshares or Path to Exile. This is probably the best white removal spell in M11, so I'm glad to see that here. But unfortunately, that's all you get when you'd kind of want more copies of that. You have a few combat tricks in here. Mighty Leap is in here, which can give something +2/+2 and flying. That's not a bad card, but this probably isn't the deck for it since a bunch of your stuff flies anyway. And most of the ones that don't are there pretty much strictly for defense. I mean, it can be good for getting the Scroll Thief past defenses, but it's probably not going to pull its weight too much in here. Safe Passage is also another suboptimal choice. It's a fog type effect. This one prevents damage to you and your creatures. It's not symmetrical. So you can still deal damage to the opponent's creatures, but it does cost 3 mana. And you have enough dedicated defenders in here that you probably aren't going to need it that much. We do have a Solemn Offering as another white spell to destroy artifacts and enchantments, which can sometimes be helpful. You have a bit of counter magic with Negate, 2 of them, actually, to counter non-creature spells. So not as much counter magic and removal as you would expect from Control, but to be fair, Power of Prophecy isn't a full Control deck. It's kind of like a hybrid between Control and an aggressive Skies deck. You do have some card draw, though. We already saw the Foresees, and we also have 2 Jace's Ingenuity, which is instant speed card draw. 3 cards for 5 mana, so these are the type of cards that blue control decks always like. You're holding up mana for permission spells, and if you don't end up countering anything, you can just cash in the mana for cards instead. And the final card in the deck is 2 copies of Sleep. And Sleep is a real knockout card that they reprinted in these types of core sets a few times. It just taps down the whole enemy side, and they don't get to untap next turn. So that can just force through a bunch of damage. It can stall for a couple turns. It frequently just ends the game, and I'm glad that they got 2 of them in here. The lands, 25 is pretty much bog standard for the M11 decks. You have 16 islands and 9 plains. So the decks from this set are heavily weighted towards one color, as you can no doubt see with the deck list. But there's enough that your white spells can at least show up. It did pretty well in the playtest. It did get 3 wins out of 4, so it did decently well. The deck seems mostly solidly constructed. There are a few questionable choices. The Armored Cancrix is probably the first thing I would cut out of here. Mighty Leap and Safe Passage were also a bit underwhelming. As far as cards to add, so there is 1 blue scry card that the deck isn't running that kind of surprised me. Once the page loads. No Preordain in here, surprisingly. This card was basically in every blue deck from when M11 was in standard. Scry 2 and draw a card for only a single mana is a nice amount of library manipulation. In fact, it was previously banned in Modern because it was that good. But in Standard at the time, every blue deck was basically 4 preordains and 56 other cards. So this would be another good tool for scrying the deck for the Conundrum Sphinx, but also obviously helpful in general. You could up the counter magic with Mana Leak, which is a pretty good counter spell. This is a soft counter. They can pay 3 in order to not get their spell countered, but in the early and mid game, they likely won't be able to afford that. And unlike Negate, this one can hit creatures, which is good for dealing with them before they show up. And finally, just for strong flyers, I mean, really make that white mana worth it with Serra Angel. It's a 4/4 flying vigilance. It's a classic card. It's a good classic card. And it would easily be a better 5 mana card than that Armored Cancrix ever could be. Yeah, but that's it for the deck, really. Overall, I think it is pretty solidly constructed. It is kind of in two camps with the Sky strategy and the Control strategy, but it is reasonably competent at both. You could take it in one direction or the other, and it is pretty decent out of the box. So this is one that I would definitely play again if I had to sit down with the M11 decks. But that's it for our first analysis video. There will be more to come for the remaining decks of the set. Until then, I hope you have a good day.